But it is, of course, not my aim to substitute for a one-sided materialistic an equally one-sided spiritualistic causal interpretation of culture and of history. Each is equally possible, but each, if it does not serve as the preparation but as the conclusion of an investigation, accomplishes equally little in the interest of historical truth.
Those of you who read this last passage from the excerpt of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism may have had trouble following its unpunctuated and switched-up order of clauses. What it is hinting at, though, is the fact that Max Weber is not writing this piece purely of his own inspiration, but as prompted by another theoretical lens on religion. So, in other words, he's engaging in an academic debate, and he was not the one who made the first argument. Today we'll be exploring that debate a bit further, for what it says about religion as a social institution, and what it represents in terms of a larger theoretical debate on the connections between structure and culture.
Academic researchers and theorists often construct a theory by providing an alternative to another perspective on an idea. In this case, Max Weber's theory describes the socioeconomic role played by religion in a society. The term he uses for it is spiritualistic causal, and his term for the lens he is providing an alternative to is materialistic. Those familiar with Karl Marx will know his philosophy to be known as materialism. This is not to say he values money and wealth, as the word is commonly used nowadays. It is a philosophy that the world is grounded in the material as opposed to the ideal, in resources versus ideas. Marx's focus on the social world was to describe it in terms of resource inequalities, how destitution and oppression were socially constructed, how their modern forms originated, and how they could potentially be changed. His method of examining these economic systems and their effects was derived from the Hegelian school of philosophy. It was called the dialectic. Basically, it consists of analyzing an idea in 3 steps: what its functions and merits are, the thesis; what flaws it could contain that would unravel and destroy it, the antithesis; and what the concrete solutions to these contradictions might be, the synthesis. Unlike the Hegelians, who focused on how this technique could be used to explain the dynamic existence of ideas,
It's weird. Trust me, we don't need to get into it.
Marx used it to explain how economic systems may progress and change. In order to see the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis of capitalism, an institution rooted in material resources, one must start from the assumption that the material is the basis of that institution and affects every part of social life that the institution does.
So that was a lot, but the important thing is, Marx used his dialectical training, rather than to waste time debating the nature of ideas, to analyze the mechanisms and the flaws within social systems, like an industrial capitalism within, say, Germany in the mid-1800s, where he lived.
So much as to say that this dialectical materialism is the basis of Marx's conclusions about capitalism being doomed as a sustainable economic model. After all, its thesis, the pursuit of self-interest and rationalized efficiency, would also produce its antithesis, workers who could not support themselves as their employers made profits by cutting pay and replacing workers with machinery. But more importantly, Marx's belief in the material as the foundation of social reality would also lead to some controversial perspectives on ideology and religion. A quote that you often hear attributed to Marx is that religion is the opiate of the masses. In the context of his other works, such as the German ideology, this phrase sums up a lot of what Marx thinks religion's function is in a society, particularly in a modern capitalist nation.
So let's think about this. What is an opiate? Okay, it's a type of drug derived from opium, usually used as an analgesic. Now, if we think about what does an opiate do, right? It relieves pain.
Marx also described religion as the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. In these ways, Marx can at first be seen as praising religion for its ability to provide much-needed spirituality in the setting of soulless industrialization that he was witnessing in 19th century Germany.
But there is a more cynical part to Marx's metaphor here. Okay, opiates also dull the senses and make it harder for people to perform tasks and to react to things that are happening to them.
So, while Marx acknowledges how religion may feel like a saving grace to individual people, he believes it provides harm to the greater society overall. Marx talked a lot about the proletariat being exploited by the bourgeoisie out of opportunity and resources. The capitalist class has an interest in keeping the working class poor enough to compete with other workers and placated enough by pittance wages and ideas of opportunity and meritocracy to keep them working in a system that is objectively stacked against their mobility. And Marx cites religion as one of the tools that allows this false consciousness to be perpetrated on the working class. Comforting stories and moral ethics that contain ideas of justice without necessarily inspiring activism in order to gain that justice. With the achievement of class consciousness, the proletariat's recognition of their own exploitation, it is Marx's fervent hope that the proletariat will lead a revolution into a more equitable form of economy. But ideologies and religions, being sets of ideas and fables, distract from and cloud the proletariat's recognition of their own oppression.
We'll return to Marx after we frame the debate between he and Weber some more, but suffice it to say, Marx views ideologies like religions as being subservient to the material. Okay, ideologies gain power when people with material power already believe and endorse them, which they likely do in order to maintain and further their own material power.
So, how does Weber differ in his view of religion? Well, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, part of which you read, is a theory of how religion and economy interact, cast in a much less negative light. According to Weber, when capitalism as an economic system was being developed in Europe, it was more likely to succeed and remain the dominant system in countries that were predominantly Protestant. This is the piece of data he starts with, and through inductive reasoning, he posits a theoretical explanation for these results. By diving into the Protestant ethic, an ethic being a philosophy of values, Weber discovers that Protestant denominations at the time clung to many beliefs regarding earthly works and material success. Protestants of this time, especially Calvinists, were espousing values of frugality and asceticism. Frugality basically means being thrifty. On the things you need, spend as little as possible and save all you can. Asceticism is the opposite of hedonism, the latter being the unbridled pursuit of physical and material pleasures, and the former being reservation from said activities. So monks are said to lead ascetic lives. In addition to these things, hard work by any Christian was seen to have been done for the glory of God by many Protestant faiths. Hard work, frugality, and asceticism just so happen to also be great ways to participate and acquire wealth in a capitalist economy.
So, by working hard to earn more, consuming modestly, and saving the rest, a privilege to be sure, one can be a good economic capitalist and a good humble Protestant at the same time, reaping benefits in this life and the next one.
As you can see here, Weber produces a ground-up explanation of how religion influences economics, how individuals, taking Protestant beliefs to heart and acting on them, will reinforce the principles of capitalism and further its advancement as a system, gaining themselves wealth in the process. Weber, too, has a philosophy of method, in this case called methodological individualism. The term isn't the most important part, just that he thinks that macrophenomena can only be explained as the accumulation of microphenomena, that only through analyzing what individual people do can any broad concepts like structure, culture, or institutions be defined and studied. And therefore, Weber pays special attention to how ideas may have influenced individual action, that, when taken together, create structural outcomes. You can see this in the excerpt from the Protestant ethic, the magical and religious forces, and the ethical ideas of duty based upon them, have in the past always been among the most important formative influences on conduct. Not massive social transformation as a whole. Individual conduct is what he's focused on.
So, Weber uses the sociological imagination to explain how individuals living in Europe would have reacted to this time of burgeoning capitalism, especially if they held Protestant ideals that were in vogue at the time.
We see him bring in many quotes and passages from theologians at the time who spoke to different beliefs and principles within this Protestant ethic. John Wesley's is probably the most potent. We ought not to prevent people from being diligent and frugal. We must exhort all Christians to gain all they can and to save all they can. That is, in effect, to grow rich. The purpose of such a strategy would be to break off from the somewhat stereotypical view of Christianity at the time, valuing the kind of poverty and humility that Christ embodied, and to instead encourage Christians to thrive in the material world. These revised beliefs would provide more consistency between spiritual life and everyday life, potentially producing less dissonance for people trying to participate in both, and that would potentially allow churches to hold on to their members for longer, rather than have them lapse.
I'm sure you can think of some religions or specific beliefs that felt so distanced from real lived experience that you might have found it harder to actively follow them all the time.
Intentionally or unintentionally, this new religious prescription would also enhance Protestants' outcomes
By enhancing their incomes,
and potentially expand their ideological and material influence in the world. At the same time, the latent effect of such a reframing of life guidance for Protestant Christians was that the capitalist economy gained a lot of workers who viewed work as a spiritual mandate. Very good news for growing economies. The cooperation of values and goals between the institutions of religion and economy in Protestant countries turning capitalist augmented both religious membership and economic participation.
so now let's think through the implications of these two competing views on the function of religion. First, we'll look at how these perspectives reflect on bigger questions within sociological theory. Then we'll take a look at how these perspectives can frame how we view religion in everyday social life. In sociology, broadly, we seek to explain the relationship between individuals and society, and why and how humans as social beings behave the way they do. As such, there are ongoing theoretical debates relating to the definitions of and interactions between structure, culture, and agency.
By way of brief, way oversimplified definitions, structure consists of institutions that grant people socioeconomic resources and power, and effectively a hierarchical position in a society. Culture consists of the ideas and beliefs in a society, and agency refers to individuals, their intentions, and their ability to act on them. Marx's view, as we've hinted at, is that the distribution of material resources throughout a society determines a lot about whose ideas gain power, both of which influence, in this case constrain, people's choices and outcomes. This theoretical perspective is referred to as Marx's view of base and superstructure. As laid out in the German ideology, patterns of material resources constitute the base of a society. The things that really give society and people's outcomes in it their shape are the patterns in which material resources are produced, consumed, and accumulated. Thus, everything else in a society, media, politics, seeming differences based on race, gender, etc., culture, and of course, religion, comprise a superstructure, extra things that exist above the material structure of a society.
This is not to say that these things have no importance to people, but it is to say that these things on their own will not be the most powerful causes of how a society structures itself.
It also means that resources contribute to how other superstructural things operate. For example, much of mass media is owned by corporations that are themselves capitalistic ventures. Political relationships are dominated by who can provide and preserve material resources for whom. And some of the more powerful ways that race and gender shape society are by affecting how much people get paid and what careers they're influenced into pursuing. So, the superstructure is shaped by the bourgeoisie in order to reinforce the material dynamics of the base. This is done by granting power to certain ideas over others.
The term for the way that some ideas become more popular or believed in than others is called hegemony. When a way of thinking about something, race, gender, etc., becomes the dominant one in a society and confers social power on those who believe it, it is referred to as hegemonic.
For example, The beliefs about masculinity being that one is strong, emotionally stalwart, athletic, etc., comprise a hegemonic masculinity at this point in time. There is no hegemonic femininity, by the way, because even if a woman embodies the ideal feminine characteristics of a culture, being slight, attractive, passive, etc., the ideals were still created in a male-dominated culture, and thus still represent the power that men have over women and over gender beliefs. In this vein,
Marx asserts that the bourgeoisie, the materially dominant class, will always determine which cultural ideas become hegemonic. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas.
thus, according to Marx, those with structural resources determine the dominant ideas in a society's cultural landscape, both of which constrain individual agency in a way that maintains the structural status quo that created those resource inequalities to begin with. Weber's perspective gives a bit more credence to ideas as having the ability to influence society. His book describes how individuals adopted and reconciled the tenets of both the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism at the time, acted in ways consistent with both, and thereby progressed and expanded the reach and productivity of the capitalist economy. As per his methodological individualism, he is convinced that individual people acted in concert due to shared beliefs, and their collective actions resulted in macro-level economic change, in this case in the form of further capitalist development. So here, Weber argues that culture, or at least the ideas and beliefs within a culture, influence individual actions, which help to collectively shape the economic structure of a society.
This is a slightly more nuanced way of conceiving of society, and definitely a more dynamic one. It leaves a lot of structural change in the hands of individual agents and the ideas that guide them towards certain actions.
It is worth noting, by the way, that while Marx makes statements about individuals being constrained by structure and influenced by culture into not changing the social structure, Weber, at least in this piece, does not focus on individuals' structural constraints in exercising their agency, and does not weigh in on whether cultural values would inspire people to want to change the structure or not. He doesn't even talk about changing social structure, other than the progressive growth of an economy. This is because Weber is taking a functionalist approach to explaining religion's role in forming a prosperous and stable modern capitalism, whereas Marx provides a functionalist explanation of religion's role, but within a conflict theory perspective of an unequal society requiring change.
So, what does all this mean for how we, as aware social beings, conceive of religion's role in the social aspects of our lives, regardless of our personal denominations or beliefs?
We'll start with Weber this time, since even though he wrote later than Marx, the period of time Weber writes about, starting around the 16th century, predates the era that Marx focuses on, which is his own in the bottom half of the 19th century. Weber's model for reciprocal augmentation between cultural and structural institutions allows us to see many of the functions of religion within a society, and how those functions may either cooperate or conflict with the functions of other institutions. If we take note of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, and expand those lists of values to include other beliefs in Protestantism, Christianity, and capitalism, then we can start to understand some interesting historical contradictions. For example, such an analysis could potentially help our understanding of how the first European settlers and colonies of the New World came together to eventually form the United States. At first glance, it would seem that devout and ascetic conservative Puritans and Pilgrims, and somewhat liberal, enterprising joint stock company colonists would have little in common. Even though these two ideological groups often had little to do with each other geographically at the time, these were the first groups to colonize the future United States, eventually ending up in the same nation and even on the same side of the political aisle centuries later. The question of their eventual reconciliation would be a decent direction to apply Weber's spiritual economic belief consistency model. The Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, although originally geared toward examining early mercantile and industrial capitalism in Europe, can also describe some aspects of our current political economy in America. Protestantism, along with many other religions, has at its center a belief in an afterlife, in accordance with the virtue of one's actions in life. Buddhists and Hindus call it karma, Christians call it heaven and hell. Also key to virtually every faith is the belief in things not immediately witnessed or sensed by physical means. These tenets help to advance the narrative of the American dream, even in so unequal an economy as ours continues to be. Faith in meritocracy, the belief that one day, no matter your background or social characteristics, hard work will gain you your just deserts of a comfortable living with a family and a healthy retirement fund, is the ideological foundation of our capitalist workforce. Our economy is powered by people thinking that they will get to the greener grass on the other side if they keep their head down, work hard, and follow the rules. This is very much the same prescription for living a spiritual life deserving of reward after death, and so dedication to one ideology may enable dedication to the other. This may also confirm Karl Marx's assumptions about a reason why revolution does not occur. Most workers would consider it better to peacefully wait on eventual rewards for their proletarian routine than to risk revolutionary action to improve their state right now. So, Weber explains religion as a system of beliefs that has the ability to influence individual action toward prosperity, thereby helping to drive and stabilize an economy. What perspective can Marx's work provide on religion's functions in our society right now? Well, according to Marx, religion mainly serves to placate the proletariat and prevent them from reaching class consciousness, as we've discussed. I would classify two main ways that religion may inhibit class consciousness from being achieved.
The first can be termed as distraction from the material.
As we've mentioned, many religions encourage faith in things unseen, ultimate pleasure in the spiritual, and detachment from the material to varying degrees. In this way, religion may serve the interest of the bourgeoisie by de-emphasizing material suffering and ignoring the mechanisms that cause it. Also in this vein, ideological disputes and disharmonies between religions and their members create social divisions that Marx would view as superficial compared to the larger class conflict, but which may feel so important on an individual level that it may obscure the fact that people of different faiths are really part of the same exploited economic class, and may thereby distract them from achieving class consciousness.
The second way is a bit more complicated, but can be thought of as justification of the material.
This is along the lines of what Weber was talking about, that religious belief can be reconciled, Marx would say co-opted or manufactured, in order to support current material relations. In this way, Marx and Weber would describe much the same social process, though Weber would consider it historically interesting, while Marx would find it frustrating and depressing. For example, Christianity is considered to be a radical reforming religion, meaning it was originally intended as a reform of the Jewish faith, designed to empower that marginalized community to value equity and justice over religious and political obedience. Jesus was a Jewish reformer, speaking out against the religious elite who failed to keep the community safe from their political oppressors, the Romans. So much of biblical history and many of its themes center around equity and justice. However, Christian religions today are not simply beliefs, they are institutions with structure and funding. Megachurches thrive on rich donors and provide their faith leaders with lavish lifestyles, with mansions and jets. Some evangelical denominations actively espouse figures like Donald Trump, embodiments of wealth and power with,
shall we say,
relatively few qualities consistent with Christ's example. Some church leaders also have great sway over which lessons get most play at the pulpit. For instance, will a church choose to emphasize the scripture of, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God," which denounces greed and connects one's materiality in life with one's fate after death? Or will they give more attention to "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's," which is often interpreted as drawing a distinction between the worldly and the spiritual, while justifying both?
So either by distracting from the importance of the material base of society, or by using the superstructure of ideas to justify focusing on the material, either within their organizations or within society, Marx views religions and other such ideologies as often being used to preserve unequitable material dynamics in a society.
Besides advancing specific interpretations of Scripture, there are several other examples of how religion is used to justify the bourgeoisie. Many churches' views on birth control, gender roles, sexual orientations, and more can be seen as furthering oppression on those already disadvantaged in society: women, LGBTQ individuals, etc. Additionally, largely white evangelical churches have spawned and supported many conservative political figures whose policies allow wealth to remain concentrated, as it always has been, in the hands of upper-class white people. Capitalistic interpretations of the Scripture and the racial and class homogeneity of these congregations may help to do this as well.
A notable exception here are many black churches in the South who continue to take a leading role in civil rights activism. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was, after all, a minister, and his church and many others mobilized people to demonstrate against political, social, and economic oppression of African Americans.
Their scriptural interpretations concentrate on themes of community charity, equality in God's eyes, and pursuing a promised land of equity and justice. Many black churches and religious figures still enable social justice work to this day. Reverends Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton have famously sought presidential office, and Reverend Raphael Warnock has just advanced to the runoff senatorial election in Georgia, campaigning on issues of social, economic, and racial justice. There are also negative class-defined consequences that can stem directly from the actions of religious institutions and not just from the ideas they espouse. For example, in the early 2000s, the Catholic Church was exposed as having participated in the institutional cover-up of sexual abuse of children by priests for decades, and it is an ongoing unsolved problem. This abuse has been cited as largely affecting children from working in lower-class families and neighborhoods. Predatory priests are more likely to target children from these backgrounds, mainly because, 1. These are kids whose supervision is most likely to be trusted to the church due to occupied parents. 2. These are kids to whom preliminary innocent attention by a priest feels like an empowering spiritual privilege. And 3. These are kids whose neighborhood and class values invite harsh social consequences upon those who are seen to be sexually deviant or victimized.
So, kids who were from underprivileged backgrounds were more exposed to abusive clergy, groomed by them more easily, and kept quiet more easily due to shame and fear of public humiliation.
As these abuse cases were quietly handled by the church and pedophile priests were shuffled around to different parishes to avoid too much legal or media attention, the abuse was allowed to continue as long as it didn't accumulate all in one place, but those of fewer material resources and less social power to speak out against abuse continued to be those most likely to be abused. And those who were abused obviously suffered a lot of psychological trauma and were more likely to be driven to detrimental coping, such as substance abuse, affecting psychological capacity and socioeconomic life chances.
Marx might say of these cases that those with power, the priests and many public figures who refused to publicly accuse or arraign said priests due to their shared faith, perpetuated the exploitation of the proletariat in a particularly sinister and traumatic way, with both material and psychological consequences.
So both Weber and Marx have good cases to make for how religion functions in a society. Both agree that religious values have power, whether to build social institutions or to drive social injustices. You can see both of these processes present in many contemporary examples.
In the end, Marx and Weber view religion's functions as different for several reasons, but mainly because of their different theoretical perspectives.
If you follow each theorist's position through its implications, you can arrive at the findings of the other. For example, if you take Marx's view of religions either distracting from or preserving the status quo of class-based suffering, then you must also admit that superstructural ideas do matter to the material base of society, as Weber said, albeit usually influencing it to remain static and unequitable. And if you take Weber's perspective on the importance of ideas, studying how religion can help certain countries' economies to prosper, then you must also acknowledge that some results of augmented capitalism might be notable inequalities of wealth and power, justified by class-hegemonic cultural beliefs, as Marx suggested. So even though Weber looks inductively at microevidence of culture influencing structure, and Marx instead deduces from how individuals interact with systems that structure controls culture. Both perspectives have merit, as Weber says, and the impacts of both processes are important to consider. Further down to earth, this theoretical dispute brings to light that religions have many sociological functions, both manifest and latent. They have the potential to emphasize community, to mobilize belief into action, and collectively over time, they can shape societal structure. This can happen from the bottom up, the mass individual adoption and practicing of certain beliefs, as Weber studied, or from the top down, as individuals or groups in power use their positions to infuse their beliefs with the power of their office and influence structure directly by being what sociologist Howard S. Becker called a moral entrepreneur. However, Marx would warn that those who get into a position of power will often justify the structure that allowed them to get into power. These hegemonic ideals therefore allow structure to reproduce itself and its old patterns, to the detriment of many exploited people, rather than to change in directions that equalize opportunities and outcomes. And so we may also view religions critically as ideas and institutions that can be used either to serve or to challenge the rich and powerful.
I hope this spotlight on the sociology of religion was interesting to you, and I hope it provided some enlightening perspectives on how sociologists consider the roles of religion in a society. Thank you all for tuning in.